Hello, I'm Alfred Weber, and we're very happy again to be with independent scientist Leuren Moret in this ongoing update on the tectonic nuclear war that is being carried out against the planet. Today's update is being recorded on Sunday, April 3rd, 2011. And one of the major subjects that we'll be covering is that scientists have now declared the major third of Japan to be uninhabitable and that it should be evacuated. We're also going to be covering the fact that major governments of the world are now engaged in a cover-up of the levels of radiation from this nuclear war, which is carrying out radiation throughout the northern hemisphere and, in fact, throughout the entire ecosphere. So it is now a false flag on the order of September 11th, 2001, if not beyond. Welcome.
Thank you, Alfred. It's
Leuren.
always very, very interesting and a real growth process to do these interviews with you. I appreciate so much how much we've shared and learned together.
You know, and also I would like to mention to those people who are watching, because some people have left supportive comments and some people have left negative comments, that there appears to be outside interference playing with the focus on Ms. Moret's camera and deliberately showing her out of focus. And this is a technical issue that we spent a lot of time trying to correct. We're going to continue to correct it, but those people who are attacking us on that subject are merely adding their weight to the COINTELPRO and to the government cover-up that is accompanying this now planetary tectonic nuclear false flag operation. So that's why Ms. Moret's image is slightly out of focus. Now, we'll be covering the various levels of this ongoing tectonic nuclear war that's being staged from Japan. And the first level, of course, is on Japan itself. And what has occurred in this immediate kind of time frame?
Well, on March the 30th, Dr. Chris Busby, who is the location expert for the British government and the European Parliament, held a press conference and did an interview with Russia Today. And he declared that the northern third, or the northern part of Japan, is uninhabitable now and in the future because of the high levels of radiation contamination from Fukushima. And I was able to visit Marion Falk this week. He is one of the last Manhattan Project scientists. He made the hydrogen bomb work for the U.S. by solving all the problems on it. And he's more than 90 years old. I've worked with him for 11 years. He's a very, very special person and mentor that I've had the great good fortune to work with and to meet and know. He was also the radiation rainout and snowout expert of radioactive materials, just exactly contaminating the whole northern hemisphere. And he did all the research for the U.S. nuclear weapons program during atmospheric testing on this very issue. He's one of the top experts in the United States and in the world on this, and he agreed with Dr. Busby when I showed him the news story, the interview with Busby, and I said, Marion, what is your opinion on this? And he said, well, I think he's right.
Right. So these are, and of course, Dr. Chris Busby is with the with the European Parliament low-level radiation expert. He's with the Commission on Radiation Risk, and he has stated that in fact the the Fukushima event is more serious than the Chernobyl event.
It is, and the reason is because, first of all, the Chernobyl reactor was smaller than just one of the Fukushima reactors that had the hydrogen explosion. There are 6 reactors at Fukushima. They were all in meltdown, and that started 90 minutes after the earthquake because there was no electricity to the plant for almost 24 hours. The two backup pumping systems, cooling systems, did not work because of sabotage by the Stuxnet virus or some malfunction in the computer commands and controls. The meltdown begins 90 minutes after the cooling stops. So these workers who were there tried desperately to get the backup systems, the diesel system and the battery system to work, and they just could not. Nothing would work. They finally got some backup or some kind of pumping working almost 24 hours after the earthquake and the tidal wave, the tsunami. But by then, the reactors had been in meltdown for almost 24 hours. So the whole situation was a runaway situation from 90 minutes after the earthquake, and it's just gotten worse every single day since then. What Busby said in this 30-minute interview on Russia Today, and people watch it on the internet, it's on YouTube. It's called Full Meltdown in Full Swing, Japan Maximum Nuclear Alert. And as soon as the disaster occurred with the earthquake and the tsunami an hour later, the tech response, I am certain, was dictated from General Electric headquarters, probably in the United States. And for the 3 weeks since it happened, it has followed the disaster footprint of 9/11, Katrina, British Petroleum, where the government stands back, the regulatory agencies stand back, the international agencies stand back, and they just let it roll out. And this was not appropriately handled at all. Those reactors should have been covered with boron to stop the fast neutrons and the fissioning that cause more and more melting faster and faster. And the melting fuel melted right through the bottom of the reactors. There was no, the fuel rods were ruptured, so when it did finally get water pumping, the water reacted with the fuel pellets that were exposed to air and caused zirconium and hydrogen to form. The hydrogen is very expensive. It collected under the roof of the building and eventually blew up. The cooling pools for the spent fuel rods were above the reactor, and the reactor rods melting, that was bad enough. And those are basically uranium pellets with some fission products that have formed depending on how long the rods have been in the reactor. But they're not nearly as radioactive and dangerous as the rods in the cooling pond, and there were 600,000 nuclear spent fuel rods in the cooling pond, 7 cooling ponds at this Fukushima 1 plant, and that represents millions of nuclear bombs. That would be released from millions of nuclear bombs. And so the Chernobyl accident, or that was a false flag also, was just one reactor smaller than any of these, and it was just the fuel rods burning and released into the atmosphere. This is 4 explosions with 3 reactor cooling ponds blowing the rods, the spent fuel rod, feet up into the air. And we don't even know what happened to those. We don't know how much radiation has been released, but it's thousands or even millions of times more, thousands of times more than what was released from Chernobyl. And already in the exclusion zone, the radiation level that has been measured and reported is 3 megabecquerels, 3 million becquerels per square meter. That's just the surface of the land. And Dr. Busby predicts using modern models for radiation exposure based on the dose that they're measuring on the ground. He predicts 417,000 extra cancers in the 200-kilometer zone by the year 2061. Now, the International Agency for the IAEA that determines radiation risk and sets standards globally is the ICRP, the International Committee on Radiation Prediction. And their models, risk models, are based on the Hiroshima and Nagasaki studies that the U.S. government did, and they're still doing them in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And those are fraudulent and faulty studies with a very poor risk model that estimates 6,158 new cancers because of Fukushima over the next 50 years. That's a much smaller number than the 417,000 cancers estimated by Dr. Busby using updated risk models based on studies on exposed populations other than Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors. Now, that means that among the 2.5 million cancer cases in that population that normally occurs over 50 years, that would be the expected cancer rate before the Fukushima event. It means that in the ICRP model, the 6,158 excess cancers caused by Fukushima, which is what they estimate, damage would be invisible in the 2.5 million cancer cases that would normally be there, and it would make the impact of Fukushima even deniable. So this is how they dilute data so that they make the real harm disappear. And it's a falsehood. It's a trick of the nuclear industry and the nuclear regulatory agencies from the very beginning. But the cancer cases, increase in cancer cases would be very real and probably even higher than what the estimate. And this does not take into account the impact in in terms of a huge rise in illnesses, a huge rise in infant mortality, a huge rise in birth defects, and a huge rise in mental illness. These cardiovascular disease and brain disease are the two largest increases in illnesses that are caused by ionizing radiation.
And even now, apparently there was a statement of the government which came out on April 2nd, which asked the meteorological agencies in Japan not to report their data.
Yes.
And in fact, a university scientist stated that that was tantamount to national suicide.
Tantamount to what?
To national suicide.
Yes, that's right. This was reported by AP in Kyoto's News Asian. It's in French, and members of the Meteorological Society in Japan were notified by the Japanese government that they should not report this special data and this special information on radiation levels and impact and contaminated areas to the public because it could cause a panic. And it's the same thing that's happened in Canada and the US. The government won't report what is really happening. And in California, in at least 2 counties right here where I live, the medical doctors were instructed before, which was on March, the day before the radiation arrived from the first explosion on the west coast of North America. And on the 17th, medical doctors were informed they should not prescribe or give iodine tablets or forms of iodine to patients who were concerned about the radiation risk of and exposure, especially to iodine 131, radioactive iodine, with a half-life of 8.5 days. And it takes 10 half-lives before the radiation is reduced to a much lower amount. It's not even safe after 10 half-lives. It's never safe. There's no safe level of radiation exposure. So it's been a cover-up by governments, by international agencies, by counties, by local health departments, and by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States. So it's really our city, state, and government participating in what is basically a genocide of the citizens of the countries that are affected.
So if we look at the kind of the precedent of the last major nuclear false flag operation, which was Chernobyl, what Dr. Busby said was that at the time, the nuclear industry said that the only deaths were in the local nuclear workers in the plant and perhaps some thyroid cancers among children, whereas in fact, we're now finding out that there were over 1 million deaths. And in Japan, this is a much more serious nuclear event than Chernobyl, such that the deaths may be much larger than 1 million. So that it looks like all levels of all governments, including Japan, are complicit. That appears to be the case, and we're 2 weeks into the event now?
That's correct. Not only that, what they're even feeding people. It's ships are reluctant. Well, they're not even going into port in Tokyo because they're afraid of being contaminated. So contaminated ships from Tokyo have been arriving in ports in Europe and other parts of the world, and there's a great deal of concern over what to do about this. The whole northern part of Japan is contaminated. That would be where a lot of the food supply for the people who are victims of the earthquake and tsunami are located. So they're in temporary camps or some kind of temporary housing. I don't know where they are. And what are they feeding them? Because ships coming in from other countries with emergency supplies and with food can't even come into port in Tokyo. So I don't know what is going to happen. It's a terrible, terrible disaster.
Now that we have a recommendation from the scientific director of the Radiation Risk Committee of the European Union and a Manhattan Project scientist, Marion Falk, and Dr. Chris Busby, that the northern third of Japan should be evacuated because of radiation levels there. What is going to be the impact on Japan of that recommendation?
Well, the United Nations has already recommended this past week, actually urged the Japanese government to extend the exclusion zone out further and evacuate more people. This is millions of people that need to be evacuated. And the Japanese government absolutely refused. This is typical of what happened after Chernobyl, where the most secretive and the most repressive governments were governments that were much more invested in nuclear technologies. Governments that were not invested in nuclear technologies responded much more appropriately, protected food supplies and what their citizens were exposed to. Can you imagine what the real cost will be of not responding appropriately now? For instance, a really good example is the huge increase in diabetes in the United States because of atmospheric testing and nuclear plants. And the project costs between $2 and $3 billion in today's money. The cost in 2010, diabetes health care in the United States was over $255 billion. And this is going to bankrupt Japan. Or the choice is to let people quietly die.
Well, let me go on with a couple of questions. One is that there's been some talk about Japan going under the sea in terms of HAARP events. Is that any possibility at all?
No. I'm a geoscientist with a very long career and background in the earth sciences. I've been in 50 countries. I've studied this tectonic warfare that they're using, and Japan is sitting at the junction of tectonic plates. Are all dancing around and pushing each other around, trying to do what they want to do. It's tremendous pressures and temperatures and a very, very dynamic regime on the edge of four tectonic plates. But Japan is an island arc. It's actually less dense material than the plates that it is perched on, and so it will not be subducted under China, or it's going to be plastered onto the coastline of China. It will not be subducted under the plates or under the continent of China.
But to use an analogy, it could be drowned in a sea of radiation.
It's drowning in a sea of radiation. The atmosphere, the ocean, and then of course the recycling. The Japanese current and the currents in the ocean, the Great Conveyor Belt, it's going to pick up that radiation just like it picked up the Sellafield radiation in England, and it will carry it around the Pacific, around the Atlantic, and back and forth. It's a huge conveyor belt that actually controls climate. It carries heat all around the world, and it's much more powerful and much more heat than is contained in all the rivers of the world. It's a tremendous force that most people are not aware of. And I wrote an article called Global Implications of Sellafield a few years ago that I was able to prove that just the radiation dumped into the Irish Sea from one nuclear reprocessing plant, which is nothing compared to what's happening in Fukushima, was up in the Indian Ocean and killed 25 million Indian babies. So this is a global genocide. It's a Northern Hemisphere genocide. It's an ecocide, a biosphericide. It's going to affect every living thing on this entire planet.
So what you're saying is that with regard to the Sellafield plant was intentionally designed to have an effluent that killed 25 million babies in India.
Yes, that was the research study for what they're doing now, and a scientist who worked at Sellafield was testifying to the environmental committee in the Parliament of Britain. He said, "We've been deliberately dumping radiation into the Irish Sea, and we're actually the greatest radiation polluter in the world, and we're doing research and studying it." Now, how in the world could you be doing research and studying it when they polluted the whole Scandinavian fisheries? Norway, Denmark, Sweden, all of their fisheries are contaminated from that Sellafield experiment, and it even went into the Arctic. But not only that, it poisoned Ireland, Scotland. Many people have died from this experiment the British thought they needed to do. And then it got into the Great Conveyor Belt current in the Atlantic and was carried to the Indian Ocean, where that current upwells, and the radiation contaminated lines and the parts of India, which resulted in the deaths of 25 million Indian babies. Why would they be doing that and killing their own people in England and Ireland if they weren't planning to use it on other countries?
Now, with regard to this particular event and its impact on Japan, because we're going to get into how this tectonic nuclear war is playing out in other theaters as well. Why is Japan being so targeted? Why is it that 2.5 weeks into this war, a third of Japan is uninhabitable? Why is Japan being so targeted, in your opinion?
Well, what the United States is doing is carrying a covert nuclear war. And it's always, the weapons of mass destruction are always for national bankers. This is the City of London and the Wall Street bankers, the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers, and the very, very rich people, the hidden agenda of people we don't even know. What we do know is this international war crimes, permanent war crimes racketeering syndicate is made up of bloodlines that go back hundreds, even thousands of years. They are criminal families. They're criminals, and the British Crown, the British throne, members of the British aristocracy, the bankers, many hidden vested interests are involved in this, and it's reached a really, really unsustainable and horrifically damaging stage. And basically, we're living under a totalitarian scientific oligarchy. That means a totalitarian regime which wants total domination and control of the citizens of the world. And they now have the scientific technology to achieve what their goals are, which are depopulation and eliminate economic competitors, and have basically they want two classes of people. They want their own ruling class, and they want to reduce the rest of the world to a slave class. And they are going to succeed. They're going to try. They're going to hurt a lot of people, and they think they're going to succeed. But President Putin, not very long ago, President of Russia, said they're going to try to do this. It's not going to work, but a lot of people are going to be hurt by this effort.
Well,
the reason they're targeting Japan is because Japan, for the last maybe 8 years, since Prime Minister Koizumi went out of office, the prime ministers have only lasted 1 year, one after another, in and out the door of Parliament. And the reason is that not only are the prime ministers making détente with China, but even the Emperor of Japan went to China a few years ago and apologized for World War II. Now, even Brzezinski, who was National Security Advisor to a number of presidents and wrote a book I recommend everyone to read because it's exactly what's happening. It's called The Grand Chessboard, and it's about the geopolitical goals of the United States and how they will carry them out. And he predicted in the late 1990s that eventually Japan would move into the realm of influence and the economic center or the economic influence of Asian countries. And for the last 8 or 10 years, the Japanese government has been asking the United States to remove their bases from Japan. We have 14 bases in Japan. I was horrified when I went there and saw them. I've traveled all over the world. I had no idea we had 14 bases in Japan. And so the Japanese are being destroyed. They're being punished. Their economy is being ruined to introduce change, and that is to change the wealth and the creativity and the affluence and influence of Japan before it can benefit the Asian countries and the Asian economy.
But they're virtually destroying the genome of the future Japanese generations.
Yes, they are certainly doing that. But they, just like England, they destroyed the American future, the American genome, the mental ability of American children with nuclear bomb tests. I think it was deliberate. I've had many arguments with some nuclear scientists I know, and they said, "Oh no, we just didn't know about the effects of radiation," but they knew what it did to the Marshall Islanders and the Bikini Islanders and people in the Pacific, in Tahiti, where the French did it. They know what happened. They've been studying them ever since. And they deliberately did bomb tests when they knew the wind was blowing, so it would expose populations. And then they made them swim from the island with their babies, with their elderly, out to the Navy ship that rescued them after they exposed them, and they made them swim to decontaminate them. But they certainly, all the effects of radiation have been known since before 1920.
So briefly then, you can say that one of the tactical reasons for Japan as a target of this war is because Japan was demanding that those bases, which were bases of the New World Order, in essence, be pulled out. And also Japan was threatening to pull out as an economic asset of the New World Order. Is that correct?
Of the Western bankers, yes. And so in order to minimize the benefit that the Asian regime would have from the additional support of Japan, they're willing to destroy them. And I don't see any difference between this and what Israel's doing to the Palestinians and
Okay.
Lebanese.
Okay. Now, before we go and switch over to an update on the nuclear war, on its effect on North America, is there anything further you'd like to say about Japan?
Yes, I just would like to say that this is something Henry Kissinger said a number of years ago. He said, "He who controls the food controls a nation. He who controls the energy controls the region. He who controls the money, the world money banking establishment controls the whole world." Well, they have control of that. And all these wars in Yugoslavia and Central Asia and the Middle East are about pipelines and about oil and gas supplies. And so that's what they're doing. They're trying to stitch up control of the pipelines and the oil and gas supplies. And at the same time, in the U.S. Congress and in the U.S. government, energy decision makers are eliminating alternative forms of energy, such as coal, so that they're moving towards an energy environment or supply regime, oil and gas, the really viable forms of energy, and they're doing that to eliminate competition. Because they'll have control of the oil and gas supplies. Now, the food, that is very interesting because what they've done is poison the food baskets of North America, that is Canada, the United States, and Mexico. The western coastal areas of North America are where most of the food basket is for those countries. They've just contaminated all of it with radiation that will last for thousands of years even. It never goes away. It has to decay, and a lot of these isotopes decay into more radioactive isotopes. So it's like starting a machine gun, picking up a machine gun and shooting one bullet. You just can't stop it. It keeps shooting bullets. There's no way to turn it off. There's no way to clean it up. And it respects no borders, no socioeconomic class, and no religion. It's going to kill everyone, every living thing. It will affect all of them. So as this disaster cascades and the dairy products, the drinking, the food sources are all contaminated, public health and the health of the environment will decline. The way I started realizing the impact of radiation is that I started mapping disease. And I found the highest diabetes increases and deaths were in the same latitude as the nuclear testing in the northern and southern hemisphere. So what we're going to look at in decades that are coming is that this radiation is through the environment. It's going to wash up shorelines. Nobody even knows it's there. Nobody will even realize that this a gift of at Fukushima, but it will certainly continue aiming, killing, and causing long lingering all over the hemisphere. But we also know the first report of the Fukushima disaster, the from Fukushima was reported in Colombia, South America. It's already past the hot air barrier at the equator. It's penetrated that, and it's now headed for the southern hemisphere.
Right. Which so let's segue, and we have about 20 minutes left in the segment now. So I just want to pace ourselves. Let's segue to an update on what's occurring with regard to the radiation war on the west coasts of North America and Mexico?
Well, the level now are higher than reported or indicated. Governments, the U.S. government, in fact, the levels of iodine 131 in Francisco drinking water were reported to be 1,000 times higher than Environmental Protection Agencies for iodine 131 water. So the levels are much higher, and chronic exposure to low-level radiation is the most damaging forms of radiation exposure because the body can never repair itself. It continues to be chronically impacted by the low-level radiation, and it has a superlinear effect. In other words, at low levels and ultra-low levels, the free radicals that are released, the track of the alpha, or the particles that are the energetic particles released from the nucleus, the free radicals are formed by energy, have to pull each other out when very, very low radiation in the body. If you have higher contamination radiation, those free radicals can run into each other and pair up and neutralize each other. But when the particles are very scattered and far apart, we have to steal from molecules that make life possible in the cell, and they make the cells dysfunctional. They proliferate out, damage the neighboring cells around that particle, and the damage just goes on and on. What's happening is the U.S. and the Japanese governments now are all raising the exposure limit or standards so that what we're being exposed to, which is excessive now under these new laws, be acceptable and legal. So they're just legalizing genocide is all they're really doing. You stopped measuring radiation in milk, or they're measuring it at all. Guarantee that it's going than during Chernobyl. So people listening should avoid products for at least a year. The medical doctors that as I said, have been told not to give the concerned patients iodine, which protects not only the thought, the cells in the body. There's no reported media. The government's completely complicit in the side. And what's Alfred is that Obama has said nothing. He hasn't even mentioned this disaster, but he took his wife and children to the Northern Hemisphere for the last 3 months since the disaster happened. Out of the nuclear war right now. I think it's horrible. Obama and the Prime Minister of Japan are determined by the nuclear power industry because they pump more money into elections and into political parties than any other single donor that participates in Japanese and elections. So basically, Obama is Rockefeller and a New World Order asset.
So basically, what you're saying is that the behavior of U.S. President Barack Obama in this quake, in this tectonic nuclear false flag operation, has been essentially the same as his behavior during the BP Gulf of Mexico false flag operation, and essentially the same as the behavior of U.S. President George W. Bush during the September 11th, 2001 false flag operation, and essentially the same as the behavior of U.S. President George W. Bush during the 2005 Katrina HAARP attack on the city of New Orleans false flag operation, i.e., they are facilitators and sort of compliance operators of the false flag operation.
Yes, that's correct. It took, actually, if you really look at the events and indicate the sale of GE to Hitachi 4 years ago, why did General Electric suddenly be sold to Hitachi? There are all kinds of steps and planning and chess moves, and they have to have the right people in the right position in order to carry this out. So it took a long time to plan this. It's very, very strategic, carried out. I've watched the heart fingerprint on all of this, and what's really interesting is that the iodine levels that have been measured around the northern hemisphere after this disaster are, after Japan, the highest in Hawaii. And uh, over over Canada, the eastern part of Canada, and Washington, D.C., and New York City was heated up, came a high pressure zone. It's in a perfect circle. How in the can a high pressure zone be in a perfect circle? And when you animated maps, contamination flow across these continents, it's flowing perfect around the margins of that circle. So they protected the executive, uh, the engine, the United States and Canada, in order to protect the economy and the viability of the. But they certainly attacked and targeted the food baskets of both countries. Now, why would they do it to Mexico also? They are weakening all three of these countries in order to make it easier to implement the unification of North America, a geopolitical structure or unit that is exactly like the European Union, but bankrupting the European farmers, the Japanese farmers. They are forcing those very large populations to buy from Rothschilds, who now control large amounts of farmland in India, where they can pay farmers $1 a day and export food very cheaply to Europe and Japan, force them to buy the food because they don't have any farmers anymore. Now they're doing that, the same exact thing to North America.
Right. So uh, basically, right now, with regard to Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and Hawaii, we have a condition where the radiation levels are increasingly dangerous, and the governments are intentionally misinforming the population, ordering the doctors not to treat the population, and the
Yes.
media, the mainstream media, is complicit with this, i.e., it's all the technology of a massive false flag operation.
All the indications are not only that, there is a cumulative effect to radiation. This is also the 20th anniversary of Chernobyl. Now, isn't that synchronous? I mean, the 25th anniversary of Chernobyl, which was carried out to collapse the Soviet Union and end the Cold War, 25 years later, they nuked North America to collapse the countries in North America, the three countries they want to unify into one region. So we will no longer have elected officials or governments. They will be committees appointed by whoever it is going to appoint them. And they will divide us into 10 regions. And these committees will determine what happens there. And the citizens will no longer have any right to self-determination. So I know exactly what's happening. And the cumulative effect of this radiation, this continually renewed and reintroduced, has a more devastating effect on the population, because we've had global pollution from atmospheric testing. In the economic powers, we have nuclear power plants in large numbers. Basically, now with the virus and the example of Fukushima, there are nuclear wars sitting in every country that has them, that can be turned on anytime the Stuxnet virus is introduced. Then have Chernobyl, then the depleted uranium wars, and Fukushima. We've had 100 years of almost, not quite. We've had almost 100 years of very, very, very high accumulation of an extremely poison, which has a very, very, very long life. Uranium, for instance, has a half-life of 4.5 billion years. Now, in 45 billion years, the uranium they've used in these nuclear technologies will, that's a half-life of what they released already, but decay into other radioactive isotopes before they finally become lead. That is the end product of uranium decay. It's lead. Now, what about I'm sorry, I've lost that.
Well, I have a specific question that I'd like to follow up here.
Yes.
We have one family that essentially controls the uranium supplies of the world, and also owns the bulk of the land, or is the world's largest landowner. I think it owns over between a quarter and a third of the land on the planet, and that's the Windsor family, the House of Windsor specifically. Now, the major title owner is Queen Elizabeth II. And we had her son, Prince Charles, at the Katrina event in his Scottish kilt, kind of doing the sort of Masonic presence there. And we had now Prince William detailed to the Christchurch, New Zealand harp event. To sort of, doing kind of this false civilian disaster concern, and I'm just wondering whether the so-called royal wedding coming up on April 29th, these things, of course, are planned in advance by a master criminal family, the Windsors, who are a satanic family, and whether or not that royal wedding is meant to be sort of a giant black magic ceremony on the radiating of the planet now with the Japan tectonic nuclear war against the planet.
Well, the satanic element is an essential part of the modus operandi of this international criminal cabal who's causing all this destruction to the planet, just economic gain. That's very, very well established. A very interesting book that I read is called Dope Incorporated, and this is a very thorough investigation and report on the international drug trade, which the people behind it are part of the aristocracy and the Queen herself of the British establishment. The opium wars in China and the destruction of China, a 5,000-year-old God, it's a world culture, a world contributor to tremendous things to humanity. And the British took it down, destroyed it in just a few years by turning a quarter of the country, 250 million people, into opium addicts. And this global dope incorporated economy centered in Hong Kong um, it's running an economy, an illegal underground economy that's 5 times greater than the legitimate economy. And these people worship death. They're not Christians, they're not Jews, they're not Muslims in it. They are satanic people, and they worship the cult of Isis, which is the ancient Egyptian cult of death. And this is an indicator of how far back this philosophy of disaster capitalism has gone. It goes back to the money lenders in the Roman Empire, the Greeks, and all the way back to Egypt. So this is disaster capitalism, and they're using every form of electromagnetic warfare, pernicious poisons, everything they can use to destroy humanity. And I'd like to read what one of these people said in 1623. This is an indicator of where this philosophy, where this idea came from. This is from a book called John Amos Comenius. I'm sorry, that's the author. The book is called The Labyrinth of the World, published in 1623. This is City of London stuff. They were deliberating amongst themselves as to how they could give wings to death, so that it could in a moment penetrate everywhere, both near and far. And what does that describe better than anything else that I've heard but the effects of ionizing radiation?
Exactly. Well, we have come to the end of the hour, and we'll have to leave it to our next update onto what the effects on, and I think that you just touched on it now, what the effects on humanity. In other words, this massive depopulation of humanity, and what the effects on the attack on the ecology, on Gaia itself, of this radiation war.
And this is basically the genocide of the whole human population, which had its roots in this labyrinth of the world quote. I mean, even before that, they were planning it. But basically, this Fukushima and related disasters are a depopulation plan of Henry Kissinger, the Rockefellers, Cecil Rhodes in the 19th century, and even Malthus, who was promoting in the 1700s the misconcept that there was a overpopulation of the world. They just want to get rid of all of us and grab it all. It's a huge global land grab. 85% of the world has nothing. That 15% that has everything, they want it all.
Well, as one final question, because people ask this a lot and are asking this a lot of you, do you see any cause for hope of a positive outcome?
Absolutely. I really believe that the global spirituality of humanity will survive this too. As horrendous, as horrific, as devastating as this is, there may be a certain amount of extinction. It's happened many times in the history of the earth. I can't believe it's humanity exterminating itself, but certainly it's not very welcome by most of humanity. But the people carrying it out are actually, they're not like us. They're sociopaths. They're psychopaths. They're mentally ill. And so I know that the spirituality of people working together around the world in quiet ways and not so quiet ways can overcome this.
Oh, well, I'm glad that we ended on that note. Uh, Independent scientist Leuren Moret, we want to thank you for being with us with these updates on the ongoing tectonic nuclear war on humanity, on all living things, and on the biosphere. And we we would like to invite you back for future updates. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.